The first time I saw the impossible tracks, I dismissed them as a trick of the light, a distortion caused by the relentless, blinding snow that had been falling for 3 days straight. I was a month into my posting at the Cascade Mountains National Park, a greenhorn with a freshly pressed uniform and a head full of textbook knowledge. The other rangers, all grizzled veterans with a kind of quiet, weary wisdom, had warned me that the mountains had their own rules, their own secrets. I thought I understood. I was wrong. It was my turn for the overnight radio watch when the call came in. A lone hiker, a 20-something kid named Mark, had failed to check in from a remote trail near the summit of Mount Obsidian. His last message had been a cheerful, almost cocky report about the deep powder and the unbelievable solitude. Now, there was just silence. My supervisor, Ranger Thorne, a man whose face was etched with a lifetime of hard winters, took the call with a grim, practiced calm. "We'll wait for the storm to break," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Sending a team up in this is suicide." But as the hours dragged on and the radio remained silent, the grim quiet of the ranger station was punctuated by a growing sense of dread. The kid had been out there for over 30 hours. In this kind of weather, that was a death sentence. I sat by the fire, a book on mountain survival open on my lap, but my eyes kept drifting to the topo map on the wall. The trail Mark was on led directly into an area the locals called the Boneyard, a high-altitude network of treacherous peaks and ice-shrouded spires. It was where the desperate went, and where the lost were rarely found. The snowfall finally began to let up just before dawn. The world outside was a canvas of pristine, untouched white, a beautiful and terrifying blank slate. The air was so cold it burned the lungs with every breath, and the silence had a heavy, waiting quality to it. I found Ranger Thorne staring out the window at the towering snow-covered mountains, his coffee untouched. "He's not waiting for a rescue," Thorne said, his voice barely a whisper. "He's already gone." But I couldn't accept it. Not yet. I was a ranger. My job was to search, to rescue, to protect. It was a naive thought, a city kid's desperate plea to the unforgiving wilderness. I grabbed my pack, a heavy-duty survival kit that felt both too light and too heavy at the same time, and pulled on my snowshoes. "I'm going up," I said, my voice shaking with a nervous energy I tried to pass off as resolve. Thorne didn't try to stop me. He just looked at me with those old, sad eyes and handed me his personal rifle, a worn but well-maintained hunting rifle. "Take this," he said. "It's not for bears." The ascent was brutal. The snow was waist-deep in places, and the wind, even after the storm had passed, was a biting, relentless force. I followed the trail Mark had reported taking, but soon found that the fresh snow had erased any signs of his passage. The mountains were a vast, white labyrinth, and I was a single, insignificant speck within them. Hours blurred into a monotonous, back-breaking slog, my breath a ragged plume in the frigid air. It was on a high, wind-swept ridge that I finally saw them. In the pristine, unbroken snow, right in the center of the narrow trail, was a set of tracks. They weren't from a bear. They weren't from a mountain lion or a deer. They were long, narrow, and impossibly deep, with 5 taloned toes at the end of what looked like a misshapen, elongated human foot. And they were coming not from the trail, but from the impossible, sheer face of Mount Obsidian itself, heading directly towards where Mark would have been. My blood ran cold. The tracks were too perfect, too clear in the deep snow, as if whatever made them had walked with a purpose and a chilling, deliberate grace. This wasn't an animal, it was a horror, and it was hunting. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the immense, terrifying silence of the mountains. I stood on that wind-whipped ridge, staring at the impossible tracks, my lungs burning from the thin, icy air. Every instinct I had, every bit of training screamed at me to turn back, to radio in, to run. But I couldn't. My mind, which had always been a fortress of logic, was now a fractured, echoing chamber of folktales and unspoken warnings. The tracks weren't just a sign, they were a deliberate taunt. They were a path leading directly into the heart of the boneyard, a labyrinth of snow-covered spires and treacherous crevasses. It was the only way Mark could have gone, and whatever made those tracks was already there. The silence that followed was heavy and expectant. The wind, which had been a constant wail, now dropped to a low, mournful sigh. It was a silence that made my own heartbeat sound like a frantic drum in my ears. I pulled Thorne's rifle from my shoulder, the cold metal of the stock a familiar, solid weight against my shaking hands. It was the only real thing in a world that had suddenly gone impossibly wrong. The tracks continued, a clear path of terror into the boneyard. I had a choice. Go back and report something no one would believe, or push forward into a nightmare I was completely unprepared for. My uniform, the badge on my chest, the name tag that read Kane, they all seemed to weigh a ton. I had a duty, a greenhorn's stupid, stubborn duty. I followed the tracks. The snow was deeper here, the air so thin it felt like I was breathing glass. The tracks were a guide, but also a constant chilling reminder of what I was following. They were always a few feet ahead of my own, a perfect, unbroken line of terror in the pristine white. It felt less like I was tracking a monster and more like I was being led. The psychological torment had already begun. The wind began to carry faint sounds, not words, not howls, but something in between. A series of clicks and rasps, a sound like a dry throat trying to speak. It was just background noise at first, a part of the wind. Then it began to form a pattern, a rhythmic, maddening sound that seemed to be echoing a few feet ahead of me, just out of sight. The mountains themselves seemed to conspire against me. The high peaks, shrouded in swirling fog, took on the aspect of skeletal giants watching my every move. The treacherous ice fields, barely visible beneath the snow, were a constant threat. But I kept going, my eyes fixed on the tracks, my ears straining against the clicks and rasps of the wind. I was deep in the boneyard now, a place of immense, silent stone and endless white. And then I saw it. The tracks led to a small, isolated cave mouth, a black gash in the otherwise pristine wall of snow and ice. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a desperate, terrifying hope that Mark was inside, waiting for rescue. I moved faster, my heart pounding in my ears, my focus locked on the cave. I came to a sudden stop. In the snow, just outside the cave entrance, was a single, perfectly preserved backpack. It was Mark's. The bright orange fabric, the frayed straps, it was exactly as described in the report. I knelt, my hands shaking as I reached for it. It was too light. The pack was empty, the contents removed with a chilling surgical precision. The straps were undone, but the clasps were intact. There was no sign of a struggle, no ripped fabric, no blood, just a hollow, empty pack. My hope, my desperate, foolish hope, evaporated in an instant. This wasn't a rescue, it was a recovery mission, and the predator that had taken Mark was still here. I knew it. I felt it. Then a new sound reached me. Not the clicks or rasps, not the wind. It was a voice, faint, distant, carried on the wind from the depths of the boneyard. It was a young man's voice, muffled by the distance and the wind, but the words were clear. Help! Me! It was Mark, and he sounded like he was in agony. Every bit of my training, every fibre of my being screamed at me to follow the sound. But in the deep, silent part of my soul, the part that was now shattered and terrified, I knew it was a lie, a lure. It was a game. The clicks and rasps began again, closer now, and the voice was still calling, a desperate human sound of pain and fear. The predator was toying with me, playing on my sense of duty, and it was winning. I stood frozen in the deep snow, the rifle feeling like a useless weight in my hands. The voice, Mark's voice, was calling to me from the darkness, a desperate plea for help that tore at my resolve. I knew it was a lure. I knew it was a lie. But my ears, my human instinct, screamed at me to follow the sound. The clicks and rasps of the wind seemed to mock my hesitation, to whisper a promise of what lay in wait. The predator was winning. I finally managed to tear my eyes away from the direction of the voice, forcing myself to follow the trail of impossible tracks. They led me higher still, deeper into the boneyard, a treacherous landscape of sheer ice walls and gaping crevasses. The wind here was a constant, furious force, a blinding white blizzard that stole my breath and bit at every inch of exposed skin. It was in this unforgiving place that I finally came to a realization that was even more terrifying than the tracks. I wasn't just a target. I was a witness. This wasn't a random hunt. It was a cruel, intelligent game. As I rounded a particularly treacherous bend, the tracks led me to a small, isolated cave, a dark, jagged opening in the side of a sheer ice wall. The cave wasn't a natural formation. It was a dark, gaping wound in the mountainside, a place of profound, unnatural cold. And from its depths, I could hear a new sound. It wasn't a voice. It was a low, mournful moaning, a sound of immense suffering and profound, soul-deep hunger. It was a sound that had no place in the natural world. I didn't need to see the Wendigo to know it was there. I could feel its presence, a cold, malevolent weight that pressed in on me from all sides, a chill that seeped into my very bones. The silence was back, but now it was a different kind of quiet, a heavy, expectant stillness. The moaning from the cave stopped. The wind died. There was no sound at all, just the slow, steady beat of my own heart, a frantic drum in the silent, waiting wilderness. I knew this was the moment of truth. My legs, frozen with a fear so profound it was physical, wouldn't move. My rifle, a useless piece of cold metal in my hands, felt like a child's toy. And then I saw it, a shape, a blur of motion in the periphery, a flash of white against the deep, dark rock of the cave mouth. It was impossibly fast, a skeletal figure that moved with a horrifying, loping grace. I didn't see the full form, didn't see its eyes or its talons. I just saw the impossible speed, the chilling, inhuman movement, and I knew, with a certainty that iced my blood, that it had been toying with me all along. It had been leading me here, into its home, into its trap. Then the moaning began again, but this time it was closer. It was coming from right behind me. A wave of sheer, unadulterated panic washed over me. I scrambled, turning wildly, my rifle aimed blindly into the empty snow. There was nothing, just the deep, silent cold of the mountains. But the moaning was still there, a low, guttural sound that seemed to be echoing from inside my own head. It was a horrifying new layer to its torment. It was getting inside my mind. I stumbled back, my feet sliding on a patch of ice, and fell hard. My rifle clattered from my hands, skittering across the ice and disappearing into a deep, dark crevasse. I was unarmed, alone, and completely at its mercy. The moaning grew louder, a chilling symphony of human suffering and inhuman hunger that seemed to be coming from all around me. I felt a profound primal urge to run, to flee, to escape. But my legs, frozen with fear, wouldn't move. I was trapped, and the hunt was finally over. Or so I thought. In that moment of utter terror, a new, desperate plan began to form in my mind. A plan so insane, so reckless, that it might just be the only way to survive. I had to face the hunger. I had to face the cold. I had to face the mountain's darkest secret. And I was going to do it with nothing but my wits and the sheer, brutal will to live. The terror was a suffocating blanket, but beneath it, a desperate clarity took hold. I was in its home, unarmed, and it was playing with me. The moaning, that horrid symphony of hunger and pain, was my cue. It wasn't just a sound. It was the creature's way of marking its territory, a preparing for the feast. The whispers had stopped, the voice of Mark gone. This was the end game. It was time for me to stop running and start fighting. My plan was insane, a last-ditch effort born of sheer, brutal will. It hinged on the single most precious thing I carried in my pack, a small, waterproof box containing emergency flares. The Wendigo was a creature of ice and cold. Fire, I gambled, was its antithesis. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the searing pain in my twisted knee, my eyes frantically searching the vast, pitch-black cavern for anything that could help. I was blind, surrounded by an evil I could feel but not see. The moaning grew louder, a chilling symphony that seemed to be coming from all sides, and I knew it was closing in. My hands, numb with cold and fear, fumbled in my pack, my fingers scraping against the various items until they finally found the hard plastic of the flare box. I tore it open, pulling out a single flare. Its cold, plastic shell felt like a small, fragile life raft in an endless, freezing ocean of despair. But it was my only weapon, my only chance. A new sound joined the moaning, a rhythmic tapping, like skeletal knuckles on rock, but coming from the darkness just in front of me. Tap, 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 tap. It was followed by a low, rasping breath, so close I could feel the cold, dead air of it on my face. My blood ran cold. The creature was here. It was right in front of me, and it was waiting for me to make a move. I stood completely still, my heart a frantic drum in my ears, the flare a useless, unlit piece of plastic in my hand. I could feel its gaze on me, a cold, predatory stare from those glowing, empty eye sockets I knew were there. It was a game of cat and mouse, and I was the mouse, cornered in a deep, dark hole. But I had one last trick. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to ignore the moaning, the tapping, the crushing cold. I focused on the one thing that still felt real, the memory of Ranger Thorn, his sad, world-weary eyes, and his warning. It's not for bears. He knew. He had known all along. I took a deep, shuddering breath, and when I opened my eyes again, the fear was still there, but it was now a cold, hard, unyielding resolve. I moved, not forward, not back, but to my left, towards the sound of a small stream I could hear trickling down the cavern wall. The creature shrieked, a high-pitched, enraged sound that flayed my nerves raw. It knew I was trying to escape. I scrambled, my legs screaming in protest, towards the sound of the water, my mind fixed on my plan. The cavern floor was treacherous, a maze of loose rock and treacherous footing, but I pushed on, guided by the sound of the water and the sheer, brutal will to live. I reached the stream, a small, freezing trickle of water that poured down a sheer rock face. The moaning was right behind me now, a constant, guttural roar of hunger and rage. I turned, the flare gun in my hand, and in the beam of my headlamp, I finally saw it, the Wendigo. It was impossibly emaciated, its flesh stretched taut over a skeletal frame. Limbs like gnarled branches, ending in hands with elongated, razor-sharp talons. Its head was a skull, with two enormous glowing embers in the empty eye sockets that promised nothing but unending consumption. It was a nightmare given form, a creature born of ancient, unfathomable cold, and it was coming for me. I aimed the flare gun not at the Wendigo, but at the ice wall above its head. With a final, desperate prayer, I pulled the trigger. The flare shot forward with a deafening bang, a brilliant spear of red light that slammed into the ice wall with an explosive roar. The ice, already weakened by the constant dripping of the stream, fractured and broke, and an immense sheet of it, a wall of pure frozen power, crashed down on the Wendigo. The creature shrieked, a sound of pure agony and enraged frustration, as it was swallowed by the immense falling ice. The sound was a triumph, a victory, a final beautiful song in the deep, silent cold of the cavern. I collapsed, my body shaking with a terror that was now a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. I had survived. We had survived. But the knowledge, the terrifying, absolute knowledge of what was out there, would never leave me. The Wendigo hadn't been killed. It had just been driven back. The mountain had an ancient hunger, and I, a simple ranger, had just managed to escape its maw. The hunt was over, but the fear, the cold, silent fear, would haunt my every waking moment for the rest of my life. The mountain's darkest secret was now a part of me, and I knew, with a certainty that iced my blood, that it would be back. It always came back.